I'm here with Mark Olival-Bartley. Mark, thank you so much for joining me on Walking Inside Poems.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, John.
It feels like it's been a long time since we first started talking and about the possibility of doing this episode. I'm glad we finally got it together, and I'm looking forward to talking about W.S. Merwin with you.
Me too. Yeah, especially this poem. I think it has it encapsulates a lot about Merwin's poetics as well as the man himself.
Fantastic. Well, I know you're coming to us from Munich, Germany. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I was born and raised in Hawaii, but I've been living here in Munich for about 14 and a half years. And I still keep my connections to Hawaii. I go home every year, but this is now home. And yeah, so I'm an expat Hawaiian
Okay.
here in the Bavarian capital.
Nice. So if you will, just tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself. I usually call it a potted biography, just a quick little summary of who you are.
Sure. So I'm 56 years old, and as I mentioned, I'm from Hawaii. I'm from the island of Oahu, where Honolulu is situated. And my hometown is the second largest town after Honolulu, called Kailua. Not much of a name, but it was put on the map recently because President Obama made that his go-to Christmas vacation spot. But the place itself is idyllic, really, as it comes, or so I thought until I eventually visited Haiku Maui, where Merwin is from. But it was an upbringing in a place, a small beach town on Oahu, maybe about 40,000 people. And it was really a fantastic way to grow up. Me being who I am, I was less a surfer and more of a bookish nerd. And I always longed to travel. And so when I was a senior in high school, I traveled to Greenland and Denmark as an exchange student, and I lived there. And in learning Danish and Greenlandic, the travel bug bit me. And so I always would return home to Hawaii, and I did my studies. First, I studied literature at the University of Hawai'i at Manoa, the big public institution in Honolulu. And then later I transferred to a private university where I studied applied linguistics and teaching English as a second language. Mainly because so many of my friends who were at the University of Hawai'i at Manoa who studied poetry ended up being waiters. And I thought, well, as like I could always teach English.
Yeah.
And what happened is that my love for literature never ended. It just became more. I became more interested in the technicalities, the poetics, the artifice of poetry. And so what studying applied linguistics did for me as a writer was make me keenly interested in what makes language tick and how artifice, poetic artifice, that is, things like rhyme, meter, metaphor, image, can transport us in a way through verse that not even prose can do. And I forgot to mention, as a child, I always I had dreamt of becoming a prose writer. My big hero was John Gardner, on becoming a novelist, The Art of Fiction, all of his books, Grendel, The Resurrection, October Light,
Yeah.
Even the latter stuff like Mickelson's Ghosts and The Unfinished Shadows are things. In fact, I have Jason and Medea on my shelf back here somewhere. And Gardner's approach to fiction is how I thought all literature should be approached. But what I learned through studying linguistics is that there are things that verse can do that prose can't. So I traveled a lot. I went to New York City, where I lived for 5 years in Harlem, and I studied at City College. And I had the good fortune to work with Marilyn Hacker, Alfred Korn, and Elaine Equi, along with, I didn't know Wayne Kostobaum so much as some others did, but Marilyn Hacker was one of my heroes. And so reading her sonnet sequence, I think it's called Love, Death, and the Changing of the Seasons, in Hawaii and then working with Marilyn in a workshop was extraordinary, and it changed my life. I did some workshops at the Gotham Writers Workshop in New York, and I worked with a great poet named Dean Kostos, you may know. His one of his books, I think his first book was titled, a great title, "The Sentence That Ends with a Comma," and so I started getting into the poetry scene in New York for about 5 years. I returned to Hawaii, and shortly after that, I met my future wife, and she we met shortly at the end of her stay in Hawaii. And the question was, well, what do we do? Do I move there or do we break up? And so I tried it out, and I've been here ever since. And that was about 15 years ago. Since then, I've been teaching English and doing teacher training, especially writing. And what I've discovered is that the technical side of understanding language and looking it through the prism of a second language learner changed my own writing.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And so like J.V. Cunningham and these writers that really focus on artifice is how I've done my work. I was a poet in residence at EcoHealth Alliance, where I wrote poetry about disease spillovers and pandemics. And almost every issue of EcoHealth, I would look through the articles, find a common theme, and write a poem about it. And I always tried to do it in rhyme or meter or do some kind of formalist thing. And so now, I guess talking about Merwin with you really brings me back to my roots in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Later, I'll tell you about how I spoke with him once and tried to meet him.
Yeah, let's do. Well, what a fascinating life, and plenty left to do for sure. Well, thank you again for being here, and I'm so glad that we're going to talk about Merwin. I know you have a lot of insight, and he is definitely one of my favorite poets. The poem we're going to talk about today comes from this book, The Moon Before Morning. But just in case, I've also got the vixen here, and Opening the Hand, and The Lice, which has his wonderful poem for the anniversary of my death that maybe we'll bring up. And the first 4 book of poems, in case we want to talk about any of that. We probably won't get to it. But let's start by listening to him read this poem, Homecoming.
Homecoming. Once only, when the summer was nearly over, and my own hair had been white as the day's clouds for more years than I was counting. I stood by the garden at evening. Paula was still weeding around flowers that open after dark. And I looked up at the clear sky and saw the new moon. And at that moment, from behind me, a band of dark birds, and then another after it, flying in silence. Long curving wings hardly moving. The plovers just in from the sea. And the flight clear from Alaska. Half their weight gone to get them here. But home now, arriving without a sound as it rose to meet.
I fear that was not really, the audio quality was not there. I don't want to remove it because I want us to hear his voice, but I'm going to edit this in. I'll just read the poem quickly here. Homecoming. Once only, when the summer was nearly over, and my own hair had been white as the day's clouds for more years than I was counting, I looked across the garden at evening. Paula was still weeding around flowers that open after dark, and I looked up to the clear sky and saw the new moon, and at that moment, from behind me, a band of dark birds, and then another after it, flying in silence, long curving wings hardly moving, the plovers just in from the sea, and the flight clear from Alaska, half their weight gone to get them home. But home now, arriving without a sound as it rose to meet them. Let's talk about this poem, but before we do, actually, let's talk a little bit about your connection to Merwin. And have you visited his home there where he had the palm trees and the incredible environment there?
Yeah, yes and no, interestingly. I have two brothers. One is a virologist and a disease scientist in New York, and the other is a chef in Hawaii. And my brother, who's a chef, lived close to Haiku. And on one of my trips home from Munich, I really wanted to meet Merwin. I really did. He was getting older, and I knew that this would be one of the final opportunities. And I was in the middle of writing my dissertation about a metasonnet by Edwin Arlington Robinson. And I knew that Merwin was a huge fan of Robinson when he was a student at Princeton. In fact, Scott Donaldson, who wrote Robinson's biography for, it was published by Columbia University Press, opens the biography of Robinson in contemporary Paris, where Merwin is giving a reading at Shakespeare and Company. And the reading goes great. It's kind of hot, a lot of noise outside, horns honking, of course, very Parisian. And at one point during the signing, a woman walked up to him and asked this question: "Is it true that you really liked Robinson's sonnets?" And without missing a beat, Merwin breaks into Reuben Bright, the sonnet about a butcher whose wife is dying and he can't do anything about it, and makes him stop wanting to be a butcher. But halfway through the poem, Merwin forgets, and someone else in the shop picks up the thread, knowing the poem, and finishes it. And Merwin turns to her and says, "Does that answer your question?" And so I thought my lead to Merwin would be through Robinson. And so I did something really reckless. I went on to Abe Books and I bought a signed edition of Robinson's sonnets from 1928. There was a trade edition, and then there was this edition that was by Crosby Gage that had 500 copies signed by the poet. And I got one, and I mailed it from Munich. And I said, "Look, I'm a Hawaiian poet. My brother lives in Haiku. I would love to have a cup of coffee with you. And by the way, as an act of good faith, to show that I really mean what I'm saying, I know you love Robinson. And this is just to say thank you for all your contributions to American letters." I didn't hear from him for a month, 2 months. And so I wrote a note when I was in Hawaii to his address. He had a P.O. box. And I had my Hawaiian cell phone, and I heard nothing. And so when I was in Maui to visit my brother, I said, he asked me, he said, "Did you meet Merwin yet?" Because people would see him around town, and he was very active in the environmental community. And I said, "No, I haven't seen him yet." He said, "Well, let's just go see if we can drive over there." And so he lives on land that was reclaimed from a Dole Pineapple Company, I think, or some pineapple field. And this was soil that was totally ruined. Merwin painstakingly adds to it through sales of his books and his income and inheritance, and really spends time working the land, and it becomes this lush, verdant space. But it's so off the beaten path and right on this precipitous poly cliff, that there's no Wi-Fi. I mean, he's just out in the boondocks.
Which he was fine with.
He loved. Yeah. And so my brother found the house through a friend, and we drove out there. There are all these "do not enter" signs. And I was faced with the conundrum, I've come all this way. What do I do? Should I hop the fence? And I couldn't do it. No. And so instead, we went out to the cliff about 50 yards away, where Merwin would walk to. I think he wrote a lot of poems set in these spaces. And then we went to dinner, and we drove to another beach, a place called Big Beach, with also a very shoddy cell reception. And just as we were getting ready drive to the airport in Kahului and fly back to Honolulu, my little crappy mobile cell phone made a little ding saying that there was a message.
Mm.
And so I played the message, and it was Paula, who's mentioned in the poem, Paula Merwin, who says, you know, I don't know if this is whatever your name is, I can't read your handwriting, but I've tried so many iterations of phone numbers. So they tried to reach me, but they couldn't read my bad handwriting. And so I called her, and the phone was cutting in and out. And, you know, the sunset is falling. Kaho Olave is in the distance. Humpbacks are playing. The wind is whipping by. And I'm talking to Paula Merwin, and she says, hold on a second, Bill. And Merwin gets on the phone. And he says, in that wonderful, like we just heard, oral tone voice, Mark, thank you for the book. And he starts asking me questions about how you get to Munich from Hawaii, you know, where are the connections? And it was wonderful, but he was, you know, he was kind. And he asked me a few questions about my work, my dissertation on Robinson. And, but I think I got the sense after about 5-10 minutes, he wanted to wrap it up. And I remember this is the for me, the key moment of the story. I asked him, you know, before you go, could I just ask you one question? He said, this is something I've been meaning to ask you. And I asked the same of Donald Hall and some other poets, Laureate, Robert Haas, Robert Pinsky. And the question is this: Edmund Arlington Robinson won the Pulitzer, I think 3 times, 2 times at least, was nominated for the Nobel Prize 4 times. Every poet laureate that I can think of a certain age cites him as an influence, and yet he's now out of print. How do you reckon with this, that he is an influence to great poets, or at least poets of some acclaim, and yet wholly unread? And he kind of chuckled, and this is what he said. He said, you know, Mark, for the life of me, I can't think of a reason why anyone would bother to read, let alone write poetry. And wow, I was nervous. I laughed. I thought he was making a joke. But that's how the conversation ended. He said goodbye, and that was it. And the only other contact I had was one last time. I got the book that you have. There it is. And I sent it. I sent my copies of the Library of America 2-volume version, and he signed it generously. And this, along with Garden Time, he signed. And a note came from his son, and he said, "Look, you know, my dad can't write anymore. His arm is broken, and these are probably the last books he's going to sign." And so his son, Paula and Merwin's son, wrote a nice note, and not long after that, Paula died first. She was sick with cancer, and then of course Merwin passed, and then the house became an eco-poetics institution, and it's really I think a lively part of the cultural scene in Maui. Paula and Merwin were always part of the environmental scene, occasionally doing readings on Maui and some of the other islands, but really, he, like you said, he was there to sort of hole up and live his life gardening and writing. And that's what he did. He wrote and gardened.
What do you make of that comment of his?
The end comment about why would anyone?
Why would anyone? Yeah.
When the moment happened, John, I really thought he was making a kind of joke or a quip. Sure. Right? You know, there's a great anecdote that Donald Hall has about meeting T.S. Eliot in London. And T.S. Eliot says to him, you know, when they meet at the in the publisher's office in London, I guess T.S. Eliot says to Donald Hall, you know, you're a Harvard man, I'm a Harvard man. You're going to Oxford. I was at Oxford. What advice can I give you as a fellow American? Well, do you have long underwear? and Donald Hall said, I do. And it took him about a year to realize it was a joke.
Yeah.
And so I thought Merwin was kidding then.
Yes.
But now, to answer your question, candidly, I think to a certain degree, Merwin probably realized the limitations of poetry, even a lifetime spent, the knowledge we gather. This is the question poets always ask. You know, what is the nature of the art and its purpose, especially if you write politically themed art, as Merwin did since Lice, at least. That, you know, this conundrum between having an aesthetic goal and a polemic goal, what comes of either? I think Merwin is a best case scenario, but if he was being sort of candid and, you know, showing us the cards close to his vest, he might have been saying that, yeah, even after all this, all the accolades, all the work, all the books, you know, just in the end, nothing changes.
I think I'm going to choose to take it as a little bit of a Zen koan that he offered you there.
Yeah.
That we're going to chew on and continue to chew on. But yeah, sure, he was close to the end of his life. He probably wasn't writing much. He probably was. It's difficult not to be a little bit cynical about the world and say, was it worth it? What good did it do? But I don't know, maybe if he talked to him on a different day, he might have said something different, you know?
Might have. And the other thing too to remember is, you know, the real beauty of poetry is that, unlike prose fiction, there are no seductions of money. You know, we do it like the way a vicar writes a sermon. It's really for love and for this Buberesque connection between I and thou. That's it.
Yeah. And as cliche as it is, it's one of those things that if you do it, it's because you can't not do it.
Yeah.
So let's get into this. You're a fascinating guy, by the way. We could talk for hours, I can tell. Let's get into this poem a little bit. And for those uninitiated to Merwin, one of the first things they're going to notice is that there's no punctuation.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was looking back at some of the early poems. For example, I think in the Lice, early on in that book, there are a few periods. I don't think there's any commas, but there are a few periods. But very soon, as you read through that book, there's nothing in terms of punctuation. And I know there's probably plenty of places online where people can hear him talking about that. But let me just ask you, how do you think about that? Why would he not use punctuation at all, not even a comma?
I've given this a lot of thought, and especially in like knowing that, you know, we were going to have this conversation. And something that I remembered many years ago, decades ago, there was an alternative weekly newspaper in Honolulu called the Honolulu Weekly. And I'm sure you can somehow find the interview, but the Honolulu Weekly interviewed Merwin, I think probably more about his environmental advocacy than his poetry, but of course his poetry came up. And this question about punctuation came up too. And as I recall Merwin's answer, it had something to do about the poem that lay beneath the poem. Mm-hmm. And you and I, through an email exchange before this meeting, talked a little bit about this epiphanic moment that the young boy Merwin had with his mother in New Jersey or Pennsylvania. And Merwin, as a young boy, is on the sidewalk and he sees some tufts of grass poking through the blocks of concrete, and he's a little bit confused. And he asks his mother about it, and she explains, well, underneath the concrete is grass trying to break through. And the way that I think of Merwin now, as someone who uses punctuation as a as a tool to affect a kind of direction for the poem to be read. It was fascinating to hear him read it because there were caesures and pauses in places where I wouldn't have put them.
Right.
But my sense is that Merwin is, I've forgotten the name of her first name, but Rosenblatt has this idea of the transactional poem, and that the poem itself is just a dead thing. It only comes alive truly through each individual reading and experience. Every reading, even by the same reader, is singular. And I think what Merwin is really doing is giving us an invitation to pause as we will, to think a little bit more, to become more attentive, to think, okay, syntactically, where does that sentence start and where does it end? Where is the aside? What is the object of the preposition? And by having commas absent, the way a Roman poet would have written, Virgil may have done the same thing without any syntactic marks to show phrasing and stuff. I had this conversation with Alfred Korn once where I was complaining about Merwin's lack of capitals too, in addition to the lack of punctuation. I mean, here we have a couple on the proper nouns like Paula and Alaska.
Yep.
I think that's
the only ones other than the
right.
first word. Yeah.
And the title. So that's my sense, John, is that it's an invitation to force the reader of the poem to go slower, be more attentive, and make the poem at least a co-creation.
Yeah. And somewhere he said, just in almost an offhanded way, it's one way to distinguish poetry from prose. As simple as that. I would argue, though, that there sort of is punctuation here in the sense that, for one thing, just the line breaks. The line breaks almost serve as punctuation. And also, I know he was, as you sort of indicated there, each reading is different, and for him the poem exists really through sound more so than words on the page. And so how one reads it, and as you also said, that kind of co-creation of you figure out where you're going to pause, you figure out how you're going to punctuate this. I think it's fantastic. I love it. I'm not brave enough to do that with my own poems. I do it a little bit, but sometimes I want that comma there because I want that pause right there. Now, one thing I want to ask you about this poem, what you think here, is the it at the end. I'm not sure I know what that it is referring to. So we have, he's sitting, I'm assuming he's sitting looking across the garden, and his wife Paula is weeding around the flowers. And here's he saw the new moon, and then a band of dark birds comes along, and then another flying after it in silence. These are plovers, and the interesting comment about them that half their weight's gone through that journey. But now arriving home without a sound as it rose to meet them. Is it the moon? What is it?
In my reading, and it may not be right, I read it as home, as the land. And so it's
home.
kind of
Get them home, but home now arriving without a sound as it rose. Home rose to meet them.
Yeah. So imagine, like, what I did, John. I have a cheat sheet. I punctuated the poem how I would look at it syntactically, and there are more than one ways to do it. And so in my punctuation, I put a comma after the third to last line, half their weight gone to get them home, comma, but home now, arriving. Actually, not a comma there, but the idea, it sounds as an antecedent, it's clumsy. I mean, if you were just to say home and it, especially with the personification of home and made mythopoetic with these birds. But remember, there is a fantastic poem by the Danish poet Ingrid Christensen, and it's called simply It, like this 500 pages of the word it.
Yeah.
And so if we were I mean, even saying that sentence, it's almost impossible not to use the word it.
Yeah.
And so I think, who knows what the land is to the birds. They don't have the same connection to it as the poet or to Paula. But if you can imagine, flying over the water, and there's this finger of land on a rocky coast, and I'm sure Merwin's piece of land was the most verdant there. It must have appeared to these birds, rather than them descending, as if the Garden of Eden were coming to them. That's how I visualized it.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Like a different perspective.
Yeah, that's beautiful. One thing I admire about Merwin, one of the many things, is so much of the poetry that I read is, let me just use John Ashbery as an example. It errs a little bit to me. I don't want, it's not prose. I don't want it to just be instantly, available in terms of, oh, this is what this means. I love that co-creation idea. I love the ambiguity, etc. But I think a lot of poets take it too far, to the point where you just read it and say, what the hell? I have no idea what's going on here. And I still like some of Ashbery's poems, by the way, but you don't get that sense with him, with Merwin. But at the same time, there's always kind of a little riddle going. There's always something that forces you to work on it a little bit. Would you agree with that?
Totally. In fact, I was recently in Bilbao, and at this used bookshop, picked up some of Lorca's poems in English, and I've been reading Wallace Stevens, and both of them, even in translation for Lorca and Stevens, they have their own idiosyncratic music.
Yeah.
But in terms of being able to say with greater certainty about what's happening in terms of representation, think of Merwin or Donald Hall or Richard Wilbur or Robert Haas or Pinsky, that there is not something prose-like, but maybe, if you were to extend the metaphor to the arts, representational art, where that it represents sort of a thing, versus abstract expressionism, where it's kind of anything goes.
Yeah.
And for me to get a kind of superstructure experience of a poem, rather than just a line by line flicker of pleasure from something, a coinage of Stevens or Ashbery. Ashbery just, I find the pleasure in Ashbery just being confused in reading it.
Yeah.
Right. It's just like
and there's something about the fact that he sustained it for so many years, so much output, that at a certain point you just have to go, wow. Yeah. I just had an interesting connection, and this may not work out, but I've never thought of Merwin and Mary Oliver together. But there's an she's definitely different. I think of her as being a little more didactic, is not quite the right word, but there's a little more of a message, if you will, that's direct. But they both write a lot about nature. They both have that similar style that we've been talking about, where you don't read a line and go, what? But you do have to work at it a little bit. Do you think that's an interesting comparison, or no?
I think it's a good comparison, and I think especially they both had. I mean, it's astonishing when any poet is successful, especially in a place like the United States, where poetry doesn't have the kind of larger government levers or social levers of support. Merwin and Oliver were able to sustain themselves on their publishing output, which as a poet is amazing. I remember talking to Marilyn Hacker about this in New York, and I asked her about that, and she says, "Why do you think I'm teaching?" Everyone teaches, because you can't survive on poetry alone. Merwin did, through translations, through the occasional prose narrative. what strikes me about the difference we both have eco poets, if you will, in Oliver and Merwin. And I don't know enough about Oliver. I did read her wonderful book on prosody, and it really struck me that she was able to talk about these things that I didn't always see evidenced in her work. With Merwin, I sometimes feel like these poems that we're getting are like looking at an artist's sketchbook. This is someone who has spent so much time as a reader, like spent translating the Purgatory of Dante, or Gawain and the Green Knight late in life. He could have done anything. His long epic poem set in Hawaii has its pleasures too, but in those translations, he's not this Merwin. He's as careful with punctuation as the most fastidious grammarian.
Yeah.
And so it's I think the comparison is fair in terms of like the isolation, the focus on the environment, almost like the most Asian quality of like a haiku, of being no people but earth, and celebrating that.
Yeah. Well, let's see, Mark, is there anything else? We haven't really said a whole lot about this poem, and time's slipping away here. Let's see, is there anything else you would like to say about this poem specifically?
Actually, I think two things, since we kind of just talked about the idea of Asian poetry. Merwin translated Asian poetry also, and what I felt in reading this was a sense of a haiku. So the poem begins with one part of a haiku. An important part is the so-called season word, where you contextualize the haiku, and we get this sense that summer was nearly over.
Yeah.
And then with the white hair, we see this trope extended to the narrator, to the poet.
Yeah.
And we assume that Paul is getting
analogy there, but so great. Hair
right,
white as the day's clouds.
Yeah. And then evening is coming, so we know it's late in the metaphorical day for the poet. And for me, what I found is, I think there are 18 lines in the poem. About 9 are that setup. Okay, it's late summer, I'm old, Paula's weeding around. By the way, the flowers that open after dark are famous in Hawaii. The school where Obama went to high school, Punahou, has these night blooming, I'm forgetting the name. It even comes up in the Elvis Presley movie, Blue Hawaii, night blooming something. And so they have this plant. And so there is a sense of blossoming even in the darkness. And then the second 9 lines are the arrival of the birds. And these plovers, they have a Hawaiian name. They're called koloa. And in Hawaii, there's a word, an aumakua. An aumakua is almost like a spirit animal. It's a personal family god, usually passed through the generations. And it could be an animal like a shark or a green sea turtle, or it could even be a plant. And for some families, it was the koloa. And what's interesting about these birds, the golden plover, is that they land, I don't know how they do it with celestial navigation or magnetic streams or what, but on the same plot of land. And so scientists have banded these birds. They go all the way to Alaska, John. They fly all the way back to Hawaii, and they'll come back to Merwin's yard, the same birds, year after year. Wow. And so this really is literally a homecoming, not just for the species, but for these individual birds.
That's beautiful, man. That is beautiful. I'm still troubled by the last line in a good way. I'm still not sure it refers to home, but I love that line as a sound as it rose to meet them. Well, Mark, why don't you read? Actually, you know what? I do want to read quickly, because it's a short poem, the first poem I knew of Merwin's back when I was a master's student in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, and it's probably is it one of his most anthologized for the anniversary of my death?
Oh
Is
yeah, that's
is
a
it
great
definitely one of
poem.
his most known poems? It's such a great little poem here, but
It's so good.
anyone who doesn't know Merwin, you need to read this poem. Well, we'll read it for you. For the anniversary of my death. Every year without knowing it, I have passed the day when the last fires will wave to me and the silence will set out, tireless traveler, like the beam of a lightless star. Then I will no longer find myself in life as in a strange garment, surprised at the earth and the love of one woman and the shamelessness of men, as today, riding after 3 days of rain, hearing the wrens sing and the falling cease, and bowing not knowing to what. Yeah, when I read that, I knew, right? This is one of the guys here. He does use. I've noticed he uses a lot of capitalization here. No punctuation. He does have two different stanzas to give you a little sense of punctuation, but he is capitalizing at this point. He dropped that later, but just that notion is so cool. That notion that every year we pass that day without knowing that that's the anniversary of our death. That has stuck with me, for 40, 50 years.
Yeah. Memento mori.
Pardon me?
Yeah, remember your death. Memento mori.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as I traditionally like to do, I like to have my guests read the poem in question for us to take us out. So, Mark, would love to hear Homecoming in your voice.
Oh, I'd be honored. Thank you. Thank you for this, John. It was great talking with you.
Likewise.
Homecoming by W.S. Merwin. Once only, when the summer was nearly over, and my own hair had been white as the day's clouds for more years than I was counting, I stood by the garden at evening. Paula was still weeding around flowers that open after dark. And I looked up to the clear sky and saw the new moon, and at that moment, from behind me, a band of dark birds, then another after it, flying in silence, long, curving wings, hardly moving. The plovers, just in from the sea, and the flight clear from Alaska, half their weight gone to get them home, but home now, arriving without a sound as it rose to meet them.
Beautiful. Now, did you read from this volume?
Yeah, this one here.
Because I noticed you changed a word.
Oh, you know what? Actually, I printed this up from the Merwin Conservancy's website. Is there a difference?
Yes. The fifth line, instead of "I looked across the garden," you read "I stood." I think you said "I stood in the garden."
Oh, yes, I did. And I see that in the printed version from the Copper Canyon edition.
Yes.
It says "I looked across," and in the version that is on the Merwin Conservancy website, the line is, "And I looked up to the clear sky."
Oh.
Wait a minute.
I think you read something like "I stood." Like
I stood by the garden at evening.
There it is, yeah. As opposed to "I looked across the garden." And these are subtle differences. And as I pointed out earlier, he said "here" rather than "home" in that third to the last line, half their weight gone to get them home. These are things that you're always going to be tinkering, and that can be frustrating to a lot of people. But I guess Whitman maybe showed us that you can continue to revise and over and over and over. But a lot of Merwin's poems showed up in the New Yorker. I don't know if this one was. I think this probably was one. But Merwin had a relationship with the New Yorker that spans 7 decades. He published probably more, I'm pretty sure more poems than anyone else in New Yorker. And then, of course, as often happens, you'll see them in the journal, and then later they'll appear in the book, and there'll be a few words changed. But I think that's fine. In fact, it's probably instructive and it's good. It's a living thing. Mark, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And I'll put links in the show notes for people to find you. And I wish you all the best, sir.
Thank you very much, John.
Take care.